Thank you. Morning. Well, as he told you, my name's Kevin McGrail. I won't speak about me very much today, but I will start off by thanking WebPros. Today we'll be having some of the leaders in open source up here on this panel, and they've really embraced open source and how to support it and keep innovation flowing. Today's events and the open source alley out there with these 5 companies or 5 organizations, I'm very proud of and very thankful for WebPros making it happen. I don't think Benny's in here, but if you see her, make sure to thank Benny. She was instrumental in making this come together. But this year is very special to us. We're celebrating 20 years in open source and 20 years age of Apache Spam Assassin. Myself, I'm very involved in the Apache Software Foundation. The shirt here that I'm wearing is basically a hockey shirt that I think came from one of the Canadian events, right, Rich? Montreal, yeah. And I can wear it 3 places. I can wear it to Apache conferences and conferences where I'm speaking about Apache. I can wear it to hockey matches, and I can wear it to church anywhere in Canada. So, all right, that's enough about me. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to introduce people. We're going to give them a couple questions, and then there'll be some opportunities for questions from the crowd. So starting from my right, the first person, Jim Jagielski. He is here representing the Apache Software Foundation. He is one of the original founders. Next to him, to his right, and I'm going to try and get this right, Michael Slusarz.
Hey.
So Michael is here with Dovecot and Open-Xchange, which is the commercial company that works on Dovecot. To his right is Rich Bowen. Rich Bowen is the, I'm going to say, community lead with CentOS, right, and works at Red Hat as well, which is the commercial entity kind of on top of Red Hat, or CentOS. To his right, we have Phil Pennock. He's with Exim. And finally, but least but not last, or last but not least, is Dave Stokes, who is here with MySQL and also Oracle, which again is the commercial company on top of that. So one of the things that I'm very proud of is kind of the way that these companies kind of recognize that commercialism is not a bad thing in open source. We all have kids to feed and pay for college and whatnot. And lately, there's been a lot of grumbling about commercial companies profiting, if you will, off open source. So that's something I feel very strongly about. But another day, another time. I will be speaking later, by the way, at like 2:15. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to Jim so that he can start off, because he doesn't have a lavalier mic. And I'm going to ask you, what is your organization, and what does it do?
Thank you, Kevin. As Kevin said, I'm here representing the Apache Software Foundation, which I did co-found. The Apache Software Foundation is basically the umbrella organization. It's actually a corporation. It's actually a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're incorporated in Delaware, and we're sort of like the umbrella organization that various open source projects, all under the Apache license and under the Apache way, which is how we grow communities around it. It's the home for all these projects. So when you think of Tomcat, when you think of Spam Assassin, when you think of HTTPD and Hadoop and things like that, all those are projects underneath the Apache Software Foundation. Again, in alignment with Kevin talked about earlier, you'll notice that the Apache license, the ALv2, is a very business-friendly license that was created at the very, very beginning. It was very important for us to realize the alignment between successful open source projects and successful open source business opportunities. So basically, all Apache projects are there to not only create the communities around it, but also to provide opportunities for people and like-minded individuals to create businesses around those services and those platforms.
All right, thank you. So, Michael, same question. What is your project, and what does it do?
Well, I think probably the mirror image of, or maybe not mirror image, but the different from the Apache Foundation is that we have, Open-Xchange is a for-profit company, but we have a very, very strong desire to make our products open source. And so hopefully Dovecot joined the Open-Xchange 2015. And I feel like if we did, and there's probably quite a few people here that maybe aren't even aware of that, which probably means that we're doing our job right, and that Dovecot has been open source from the beginning, and if you really haven't noticed or been paying too much attention, that Dovecot still remains the same open source LGPL MIT license. And so that's good. But at the same time, we're taking that open source core and also using it because, once again, there are mouths to feed, shirts to buy, fancy Dovecot shirts to buy.
And for those who don't know, what is Dovecot?
And Dovecot is a open source, we'll call it it's the mail delivery agent technically, but it's essentially the mail backend for a large portion of the mail servers on the internet.
Excellent. So most people are aware, the cPanel and Plesk, CentOS is a critical portion of a lot of people's infrastructure there, but I'll ask Rich, what is CentOS and what does it do?
So CentOS is a Linux distribution that is based around the Red Hat, it is rebuilt from the Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Red Hat is, as most of you probably know, a software company that doesn't sell software. All of our software is free. What we sell is expertise. And in order to build that expertise, we support numerous open source projects, including CentOS, and help those communities grow and be healthy. And my job is the CentOS community manager.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. Next question. Same one for you, Phil. What is your project and what does it do?
So the XMMTA is the bit which speaks SMTP and lets the email go to everyone else on the planet and come into you and hopefully get past the spam filters and everything else and in. And depending on how you measure, we're either the plurality or outright majority of the installs on the face of the planet. But thanks to the big guys like Google, Gmail, and Yahoo and the like, we're not the majority of the email. Just thanks to Debian, we're everywhere. Thank you, Debian.
Yes.
And as a true mirror image, we are not an organization. There is no entity. There is nothing beyond a few people who work together on the code. So we're at the true chaotic end of the spectrum.
Well, when you're looking for one, you can come to the incubator at Apache. We have, I think, 387 projects underneath our umbrella. We're always looking for more. Dave.
We can't relicense, unfortunately.
You can fix that.
Give us Hassan, dude.
Yeah. Okay, Dave, same questions for you. What is your project and what does it do?
Well, MySQL is an open source database under GPL2 with the commercial extensions. 25 years ago, the two founders needed an Oracle database, couldn't afford one, so they wrote their own database. At the time, I was programming and I was looking for a database, couldn't afford Oracle. And there was one from Australia that was kind of shareware, but kind of expensive, called MSQL. And they had this new one called MySQL, extra letters, so it had to be better, right? Anyway, 10 years ago, the big news was that 11 years ago, we were bought by Sun Microsystems for $1 billion, the Dr. Evil $1 billion. And then we got bought a year later by Oracle. Interesting thing there, as an open source company, we're kind of wondered, why does Oracle need another database? Turned out we were like number 13 or 14 in their database stable. They looked at our code and said, this is really good, but you need to improve here. Go out and get some engineers and fix this, fix that. Roughly in the past 10 years, we've quintupled in size, done very well. We're still open source. There will always be an open source version of MySQL. And version 8 came out about a year ago. And last week, we announced that our next version that comes out next month.
We'll get to that. Don't give them that yet.
Well, I'm going to give them a teaser.
No, you'll get a question for that. Yeah. All right, so I'll cut them off there. So the next thing you might be noticing is if you look in your program guide, it talks about the fact that we'll be doing security around open source. That was news to me until I read the program this morning. Luckily, I work in cybersecurity. I also, so I'll talk about cybersecurity all day long until your ears fall off. I also live outside of DC, so if you want to debate politics, I'll do that all day, and then I'll switch sides with you if you'd like. So I enjoy that. But my next question for the panelists here is a story or a security tip? Got one? Anybody?
Paranoia is not a bad thing. That's a security tip, yeah.
All right, so I think that's the end of our security. Any of you have a story you'd like to tell, just in general, about your product? Or, I think I asked you all earlier if you wanted to talk about your skincare regimen and hairstyling tips, and I was told that that was a secret not to be told.
Closely guarded secret.
Closely guarded secret, yeah. All right, yes. Phil.
Hubris. Hubris is bad. Just a few months ago, I was congratulating myself because after 20-odd years writing code and patching stuff, and had a security vulnerability for remote execution in anything I put out there. The latest XMCVE, the code I'd modified, changed one security hole for a different one because it didn't fix it quite as well as it should have. And there's a remote
Was that the
exploitable hole.
squiggly brace run one?
No. I prevented another squiggly-based run one.
Yes, I saw that one.
And introduced instead something where Qualys says it's exploitable. Cert haven't been able to reproduce, so there's some open questions to whether it's actually reproducible, but Qualys have done enough good work for us that we take their word for it, so we treat it as a security incident.
Do you actually want to talk a little bit about how the XM patch kind of became an all holy hell when that accidentally leaked publicly a little earlier than it probably should have?
Shit happens.
There you have it. So yeah.
Miscommunication inside one organization because a non-native English speaker inside XM wasn't as clear as he could have been in laying out what the timeline was, and shit happens.
Well said, actually. So how many people were here last year? Raise of hands. Okay, so a couple of you. So you'll appreciate this next question. Have any of you been in a Bollywood film?
I have not been in a Bollywood film. However, a group called Cornerstone actually did a little song about me, Brimful of Asha. So, okay, no, that's actually a out-and-out lie, but I figured we had to have something like that.
My wife would pay good money for me to be in a Bollywood film, but that's about it.
Are there tryouts here? That's what I'm really interested about.
I find somebody was here last year and just ask them. It was Bowen this morning was a wonderful keynote, and last year's keynote was, I'll just put it, a conversation starter for a long time. So, all right.
Googling going on.
So let's start in the reverse order here and start with Dave. Dave, what's something you're very proud of with your open source work?
Well, the ability for the smallest organization to run their own database to companies like Facebook and Uber to be able to use basically the same code for a wide variety of stuff and know that you can start small and grow big. And the other great thing about it with the internet is that if you have a question about MySQL, it's fairly easy to find an answer.
I think that between Postfix and XM, we're doing a pretty decent job of keeping email open and available to everyone. You don't have to be giving money or accepting advertising from one of the biggest providers. And you can set up a business, or you can be a university, or just have your own personal mail server. And in 2019, and hopefully in 2020 and onwards, you'll still be able to just run your email server. There needs to be more work on making it easy because the increasing complexity is creating too much cognitive burden. So we need to do more work there to keep it so that people can just keep running their own mail servers and not be beholden to anyone else.
Well, the thing I like to brag about CentOS is all of the amazing places that it's running. CentOS powers the data center at CERN, the nuclear research lab in Switzerland. It's also on the computer up on the International Space Station and on most of the largest supercomputers in the world. So a lot of the computation that's powering exciting new discoveries, it's all running on CentOS, and I think that that's pretty exciting.
I feel like my stories are just kind of going to be the same stories you just heard on this side. I met a young kid from Finland about 10 years ago working, and he had this piece of software called Dovecot that was at that point was becoming the dominant mail server, essentially the mail backend server. And then had the opportunity to stay in touch with him, and I was working, actually my other job was I was a lawyer. I was actually trained as a lawyer in Denver.
We'll forgive you this
Yeah, it's okay. But then, I kind of sat back and said, I can go work in an industry, again, still make money, but also work in an industry that you're giving back to not just in a small community, the entire world. So that was a very exciting, and again, the fact that we still today are able to do that while also supporting very, very large installations, corporate installations is I feel like a good balance, and that makes me proud that we'll be able to do that.
Yeah, I have to, agree with that. I mean, for me, I guess the thing that I'm most proud of, and I'm answering it personally, is the ability over the last 20 plus years to mentor people, to help educate the next generation and watch them educate the generation after that and generation after that. So the ability to, and the opportunity to have mentored people who have been extremely successful, much more successful than I've been, including someone who's sitting on this stage right now.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I would have to echo that Jim, in fact, is the reason that I'm up here. So thank you, Jim.
All right. So my next question really revolves around, your biggest regret in open source, or maybe an opportunity lost, or perhaps, the day you opened and responded to my email inviting you to be up here on the stage. So why don't we again start from that end, Dave?
Regrets? Not really. I'm lucky that I'm old enough to remember what life was like before open source. You had a branded computer and their operating system, and you were stuck with it. If I wrote something that worked on my DEC 10 or my VAX, and someone had a data general that wanted my code, it was a complete rewrite. So I'm looking back, really not any real bad regrets. Some career-limiting moves I've done for personal reasons, but really no regrets really with open source.
The open source side is fine. For the most part, the community is fine. Occasionally, you need to take a bit of break to deal with burnout because there's always some asshole on the internet. It's the internet. It's been great for my career. Every employer I've had has fully understood that sometimes XM comes first, and they've supported that, even in a tiny startup. It's the only way for me to be, I think, at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Volunteerism is something that really does affect a lot of people. I know Rich has talked about it and done a lot to try and help it. Jim has talked about it as well. It's something that does affect open source, so I try and keep an eye out for people, learn how to Zen. My big thing is I go on YouTube and I watch crazy things like there's this guy named Monty T who goes and finds old tractors and gets them running. I don't know why I love watching it, but I do. So, all right.
I will add one thing. If you do need commercial support, find a company who will provide commercial support and will help hold your hand instead of burning out the volunteers on the net. And if you've got a company such as cPanel who will sell a product who will do a lot of it for you, that's great. Please do it.
Excellent. All right, Rich.
So I've been thinking a lot about this question since you sent the email. I think that the opportunities that I have missed have been cases where I have, seen a task and grabbed it and said yes to it, rather than helping mentor someone else into that task. The most rewarding times in my open source career have been mentoring somebody who didn't think that they could do it, and then watching them blossom and change the world. And I wish that I'd grabbed more of those opportunities. There's still time, right?
I'm going to twist your question a little bit and say from regrets to maybe challenges. This is something I struggle. In fact, I was just in our office a couple weeks ago, and we argue about this all the time. It is that conflict between we are a corporate entity, but we also want to keep things open source. And what are those things that you want to give away? But then if you give that away, then you have these people, this entire group of people that you're working with. And everybody that I believe that works for Dovecot, there's a reason why they do that, or probably any open source company that they have that belief. But people do also understand that there is that tension. And then as the product manager is the one who's really making the decision, it kind of weighs on you. And so I'm not sure there's any individual decision I made that I could talk to, but the culmination or the combination of all of them, it's difficult. You definitely sit there and go, you wonder if you've made the right decision, or if you should be releasing something a little extra because you should be giving back to the community.
Yeah, I think one regret, and it's what we're exhibiting nowadays in the open source world, and maybe there's going to be a question about that, is that we've spent too much time, the open source community, has spent, I think, too much time patting ourselves on the back that open source is won, without really again, educating a lot of people on the challenges that made open source successful. I mean, why open source is the way it is, why community is important, why various conditions of the open source definition are important. And I think that that's really one of the reasons why we're in this challenging time that we are now, is that those of us who were there early and fought those battles maybe didn't do a good enough job letting people know what those challenges were and what to avoid. And so there's still a lot of, as much as the successes that we've had in open source in general, I think that some of the challenges that we're facing right now are the challenges that we faced 20 years ago. And if we would have done a better job, keeping those lines of communication open, I don't know if we would be in that situation that we are in right now.
Excellent. So thank you. So the next question that I have for the panelists kind of revolves around engineers and how our ability to name things is sometimes challenged. For example, Apache Hadoop, some people might know the story, but I believe Doug Cutting's son had a stuffed D named Hadoop, and that is where the yellow elephant came from. And additionally, a little trivia question for people here. The term big data has as much to do with the size of the data as it does with the fact that elephants are big and they live at the circus, and hence where you get things like big top, because we love double meanings behind things. So I'm going to start with Dave. I think a lot of people know this story, but for those who've never heard it, why don't you go ahead and tell us where MySQL got its name?
Are there any people from Finland here? Okay, the name MY, how do you pronounce it? So I technically work for MySQL, but it was Latinized by, thankfully it was Latinized and is now MySQL. For those wondering, Mu was one of the founder's daughters. She's now a very beautiful young lady. Last I heard, she was hitchhiking around Thailand and doing rather well. So that was the grand name of how we got our name.
And I believe Maria
is his other daughter, and his son Max also has a product named after him.
Absolutely, yeah. So okay. Phil, any cool naming stories behind XM? If not, make one up. I suggest X-Files or, the...
Be careful how you name things, it will last. Unnamed project, experimental whatever. It's the experimental internet mailer, which now is not so experimental and handles a lot of production traffic for a lot of people.
Rich, what is the meaning behind CentOS name?
There's like a triple meaning in the name CentOS, and I hardly ever encounter anybody that has heard this story. So anyway, CentOS is the community enterprise operating system. That's the boring answer. But in my other life, I'm a poet, and the cento is a type of poem that is composed of components of other poems. So you take a line from a dozen poems and you put them together into a new way, much like a Linux distribution. And so CentOS is named after that type of poem. The third story is that our logo is an ancient symbol for chaos. And this is a nod to our predecessor project, Chaos Linux, which was a very short-lived Linux distribution. Back about 17 years ago, it was only around for a year or two, and then merged with another project called Whitebox to make the CentOS Linux project.
So thank you for that. I actually never knew that Chaos had roots that led to CentOS, so learn something new every day. All right, Michael.
Well, why am I after this guy? Like, he's got these stories that go back to history, and Dovecot was named, my understanding, was named 2002, I believe the project started, and it was on IRC, I think it was IRC, and Timo Saarinen, who's the father of Dovecot, just really sent out, no offense to any Finns in the room, any people from Finland in the room, Finns tend to be a little dry in their naming, or at least Timo tends to be a bit dry in his naming. So he probably would have called it mail server, if it was up to Timo. But he had a call out, and somebody gave the idea of Dovecot, which I believe is actually Dovecote, Dovecote, which is where I believe it's passenger pigeons or carrier pigeons. I think it's Scottish or one of the Isles. The idea being is that's the place where all the mail is stored or the information is stored and the information goes out. And that's why the Civ component, for example, is pigeonhole. It's kind of playing off the idea of the bird mentality. Yeah, and our logo is not historical. I think Timo just drew a couple lines and and colored them. And so I wish I had a fancier story than that, but.
No, it's a good story. I actually didn't know all that. I love Timo. I spoke with him back. I spoke on a stage with him at a conference, and I always loved his dry humor because one of the people from Apple asked him a question, and he answered it. And so I won't bore you with it. If some of you want to hear the answer he gave, it was pretty brutal to have it right up on stage. So, all right, I didn't give the microphone yet to Jim because I believe we're on camera. It's over there. I hope it's running. This has been a long debated thing. Where did Apache get its name? And I unfortunately believe that both stories are probably correct. One of the stories is that they couldn't make very good software. It was a bit buggy, so it needed a lot of patches, so it was Apache server. The other one is that somehow they were enamored with the honor and bravery of the American Indian tribe named Apache. I think that one's more of a backstory, but let's get it definitively right now from one of the founders.
Yes, it is. It is the source and the history of the name Apache is shrouded in mist. Basically, what happened is that after the NCSA web server, which is what Apache HTTP they started off with, went away, a bunch of us just got together and started creating, a replacement for it. And we just kept on calling it new HTTPD, which does not roll off the tongue very, very well. So there was this email thread very, very early on, what should we call this thing? And someone, and unfortunately I can't remember, it most probably was Rob Thal, said, oh, why don't we just call it the Apache server? Think about it. And that's all he said. That's all he read about it. And so everybody said, yeah, it's a great, great idea. But the rationale for people saying, yeah, Apache made sense was different for different people. For some of us, it was because, oh, what a funny, geeky kind of play on words. The way we sent these fixes and enhancements were a set of patch files. And so, we're creating a Apache server because it's full of patches. And the other, more, students of history were like, well, the kind of community we're creating is very similar to that of the Apache Native Americans, where there is no real leader, that the actual leader of the tribe kind of like, alternates through the period of time. And so since we didn't want the idea of having the community under the auspices of one single person, one single leader, that sort of like community aspect, the idea that, yeah, we're building a community, a tribe around it, made a lot of sense as well. So depending on who you talk to, both answers are correct.
All right, thank you. You heard it here, sort of. How are we doing on time? I don't know how long we have in this session.
We have like 20
Excellent.
minutes.
So we have plenty of time. All right. So
Longer
now,
stories.
Dave, if you had read your homework, you'd know that there was a question about, do you want to tease your features? Okay. And I'll start off with Dave because Dave is actually doing a session, I think I wrote, 3:15. Yes. No, I'm sorry. It's actually Johnny Hughes doing it. I'm sorry. I'm asking the wrong person. It's Rich. I lied. Sorry. It's Rich, yeah.
I guess you missed your chance.
Yeah,
I did.
Sorry, I got ahead of myself thinking about Dave.
Yeah.
It is. So we're actually with Johnny Hughes, who was one of the original founders of CentOS, if not the founder. Effectively is speaking on CentOS 8, and I think to paraphrase why the hell it's taking so long. Yeah. So do you want to tease some stuff about CentOS 8, Rich?
Well, some of you may have seen a news story last night or this morning that got leaked from embargo too quickly. If you haven't, you did not hear it from me. But yeah, we will be releasing CentOS 8 today, and we have some other in about 20 minutes. And we've got another interesting announcement that's coming along with that you'll see on our website in just a few minutes.
Can you tease a little about that?
No, because I like my job. But Johnny will indeed be talking about both be talking about both announcements and indeed why CentOS 8 took so long, and what's new in it. So yeah, please do come listen to Johnny or come by our table and bug him there.
Excellent. So nice to have the release at WebPros annual conference. So, okay, now we'll start with Dave.
Okay.
Do you want to tease a little bit about your next release?
Okay. In the past, MySQL was always seen as a lightweight database with a lot of missing things from the standards, and over the past several releases, we've come closer. Check constraints and the ability to validate JSON documents or failures and things. In the past, we were kind of loosey-goosey. If you were trying to put 32 characters in a 30-character column, we truncated the stuff and gave you a warning. And with the release of our latest version, 8.0, which has been out for about a year and a quarter now, we, by default, went to strict mode. So if you're trying to put 32 characters in a 30-character field, we errored out, which means everyone who was writing loosey-goosey code was suddenly complaining, oh my God, MySQL broke everything I did, which I have to apologize to the cPanel support folks for getting those phone calls. Last week, we announced that we're getting hash joins. So for those of you who are doing rather nasty joins with your code, you'll be rather impressed. I can't share the benchmarks with you, but they are very impressive. We also are having analyze/explain. For those of you who try to get the last little bit out of your query, you put explain in front of your query, and the optimizer will tell you the query plan, what it's planning to do to get your query. If you put in the explain keyword in there, it will tell you exactly what it needs to do. So it will give you the figures on the first fetch, the average fetch, what's going on with your stuff. So those of you who want that last little 5% of performance out of your queries, you'll be very impressed with that.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Phil?
In the spirit of being chaotic, there are no particular plans. It's if you have something you need in, we will take patches.
Excellent. Well, are you guys going to embrace the new logo that the cPanel artist drew for you? It's on behind your, it's not here, it's behind your booth.
Yeah, no, I thought I didn't say that. We quite like it. It was contributed. It's free. At least 2 or 3 of us are saying yes, so we'll probably shove it up on the website and say, yay. Unless you want royalties or anything, in which case, boo.
Okay. Yeah, controversy is a good thing. Yeah. So, all right, Michael.
I'm going to channel my CEO, Rafael Laguna. If I didn't mention this particular initiative we're working on, he probably would have a talk with me.
That's a good talk. All right, Jim.
Yeah, no, no, it's called Koi. The idea being it's chat messaging over email. Why hasn't this done before? There's been reasons why, but if you take a look at it, email is nothing more than a bunch of messaging servers connected together. And maybe all it's going to take is really kind of a more concerted effort. There's already been a couple smaller initiatives. Delta Chat, for example, has this application where you can do this. What we're trying to do is again, it's a kind of a combination of not standards, but standard ways of using existing email. And then there's a few things we're doing in Dovecot, and we're going to incrementally add some things over time to make it more efficient. This is kind of a tease for my talk a little bit later. I'll go in a little bit more into it. We could have an entire hour-long talk about this. It's a very large initiative, but the idea, especially being that everybody in this room already has essentially a Koi account. If you have an email address, you have a Koi account, and that's really the kind of the draw behind it.
Well, I look forward to that. I know at a lot of foundations and companies, the mixture of asynchronous and synchronous communications leads to a lot of extra work to make things clear. So that could be very powerful. All right, Jim.
Yes, as with Brick Tamlin from Anchorman, I love LAMP. So Apache is still very much, Apache HTTPD is still very much a passion of mine. One of the features that has been worked on and will be moved into the sandbox location is basically an auto discovery system for reverse proxy for Apache web servers. So as Apache servers come up and go down, a forward reverse proxy will just natively and asynchronously be aware of those, pump those into the cluster set without having to do any kind of hand configuration whatsoever. So looking very, very forward to getting that out and people playing around with it and testing it.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to walk off the stage here. Who else has some questions from the crowd that they'd like to ask the panelists? Excellent. Okay, so keep those in mind while I walk down. I'm going to ask a question as some filler while I do that. So for the panelists, what is another job that you've had, preferably one of the odder? So I'll start off with my story. One of the things I have on my resume is I was a professional cow painter. So at some point in time, if you want, you can come up and find me, and I will tell you the story of how I got paid to paint cows. Unfortunately, Jim, you're going to have to yell into Michael's lav mic. But Dave, why don't you start off? Do you have any odd jobs? I think you told me about one last night, if you want a hint.
Well, I've done a lot of weird things, from selling Christmas trees to being a stand-up comic.
Have you ever painted bovine?
No, I've not done it either professionally or amateurly.
Okay, all right.
Well, the big joke in Texas for a lot of the newcomers, they hear about cow tipping, and all the New Yorkers say, what is it, just 15%, 20% if they're really good?
Boo. Well,
That's why I'm an ex-comic.
trying to tip cows is how we ended up painting cows. So that little teaser there. All right. Phil, did you have a odd job story?
Nothing particularly odd. I will say, if you're ever on one of those tours of a nuclear power station and you're looking down at the people all in charge face, all in their suits and the like, just before you're there, people are saying, watch out, there's a troll group coming through, pull up the trousers, guys, no butt crack. That's about it.
Right then.
Excellent. Rich?
Homer Simpson.
The summer after I graduated with my master's degree in physics and applied mathematics, I spent the summer painting fences at horse farms, applying my new skills.
Did you ever get any paint onto cows or horses behind the fence?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't
That's
think so.
disappointing. All right. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I wish in real life, probably, mowing grass is probably the craziest, when I was in high school. But I did, back in the day, used to tell, I thought maybe the ladies would like it, that I was a marine biologist. And being in Denver, it probably didn't make that much sense. So I think pretty much 100% of them saw through that one and just,
Do you speak whale?
dolphin.
Excellent.
Dolphin
All right.
only.
Jim, you're going to have to use your projecting voice.
Nothing really, just I did woodworking for a period of time to work my way through college.
Excellent. Well, got what Han Solo his role, right? Harrison Ford was a carpenter. That's how he got found for Star Wars. All right, so you had your hand up for a question.
Thank you, John. This has been great. Robert Jacoby, past president of Open Source Matters. So I know the world well. My big question is, what have you found to be the best practices for maintaining and growing communities?
I'll take that. I mean,
Do we have 2.5 hours?
for Apache, we have a core set of principles that we call the Apache Way. The idea behind that is that if you focus on creating a healthy, viable community, then the project itself will grow and thrive. And a lot of that is based on our origin. I mean, as I said earlier, a lot of it, what caused the group to get together in the first place was that we were all dependent upon a web server that was being coded by one person. And when that one person went away, we were SOL. And we never want anyone to be in that situation again. So a lot of the reason why we focus on community inside the ASF is because of that. And I think one of the ways of doing that is mutual respect, a lot of transparency. I mean, the email discussion earlier was perfectly appropriate because that is the main source of communication within the ASF and with ASF projects.
Until Coy takes over, right?
Yes, right. It is that, it enables people it's asynchronous. It doesn't disenfranchise people who are, in different time zones. It's easily archivable. So focusing on those little things that don't disenfranchise people, that encourages, diversity and inclusion. You focus on the community, and the project itself will thrive in result.
So, Rich, I know you are a huge proponent of this, and it sums up a lot of what Jim was saying, but community over code. Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Well, one of the foundation. The other hat that I wear is I actually am on the board of the Apache Software Foundation as well, and the notion of community over code is something that is deeply ingrained in our culture. Once when I was interviewing Brian Bellendorf, who was one of the other founders of the project, he said, and this is probably hyperbole, but he said, if you delete all of the code, the community can recreate it. If you damage the community, there's nothing left at all. And that has stuck with me over the years as something that's really true in spirit, if maybe not in practice all the time.
Yeah, and one of the things I know, I talk to some of some of our projects, they get to the end of their life cycle. They're finished, that particular technology has run its course, and they go into what we call the Apache attic, where they're retired. But the thing that we tell them is that's a normal part of the cycle of software, and we want the community now to go work on the next big project. What's the next cool thing that they can create? So community over code probably sums up the answer to your question. So
one of the problems that MySQL had when they started out is that if you put in a really good bug patch, we sent back a job application that really cannibalizes your community, and suddenly everyone who was your community is now an employee, which has a different set of inputs. So don't do that.
all right, who else has a question for our panelists? All right, I will walk over there. This mighty fine-looking gentleman over here happens to be my son, so.
Yeah, so, can you hear me? Just want to make sure. Pretty much, yeah, I'm not like these gentlemen here, pretty much, who have been working for God knows how long. Pretty much.
Calling everybody old?
I'm calling everyone knowledgeable because I barely even know code, let alone, and have made servers worth, I don't know, millions, trillions. Yeah, basically, I don't even know numbers. Millions, probably. But regardless, the question I had was, what program would you exactly start, pretty much, in order to get into the programming business? Because pretty much all of you seem to have mainly focused on all the codes, pretty much. But what's the not most basic?
I got a good answer for you. 4 years ago, I was talking at the Rocky Mountain Oracle Users Group Training Days, probably the best user group in the world. And they take a convention center for a week and do all sorts of training. And I was talking on basics of the database, and they brought in a high school class. And my first question to the teacher was, are these kids being punished to having listened to me? And it turns out they weren't. And the first question these kids had was, how do I build a resume? And if you're just starting out with coding, I say, well, find an open source project that needs help. Go through, proofread the documentation. Does it make sense? Do you have a better example? Even if you find nothing wrong, reporting that back in is a big help. Most of the projects, like PHP, have a list of low-hanging fruit that can easily be tackled, and it will be peer-reviewed before it gets put into the code. And if it's like you're 14, 15, 18, or 20, you could actually, by the time you get out of college or out of grad school, have 8 years of experience with PHP or some other open source thing. You've proven you can work with groups, you know how to run GitHub. That is very, very valuable to a hiring manager.
Yeah, and you will get access to people who, like we were talking up here, who enjoy mentoring young people and going through the growing pains of learning what to do, how to do it, who to do it with, how to interact with those people. So that's part of, I know, something I take pleasure in. I know Jim mentioned it as well, so I'm sure that's there. Okay, somebody else have a question?
I just want to also, add something
Sorry.
to that. Is find something that you're passionate about. I mean, open source is basically apprenticeship, for software. Open source recognizes that at the end of the day, developers and coders and programmers are artists who want to hone their skills and work with like-minded people. So find something, a program that you're passionate about. That really is the best way of getting involved in it, because not only are you doing it for an educational experience, but you're also satisfying a real personal need.
Excellent. All right, anybody else have a question? I don't see any hands up, so I'll go ahead and go back to the stage, and we will finish up today's panel with a final thought from each panelist. So Dave, why don't you go ahead and give us a closing thought?
As I mentioned earlier, I came from the days before open source. Open source has been a tremendous boon in my career, and probably for everyone in this room. There are still little areas in the greater internet sphere that we have a lack of depth. The DNS facilities that we have, there's basically a handful of folks who take care of that, which scares me silly because that's basically the entire directory service for the internet. I don't know how we're going to ever kind of get a core services support group going for basic services like DNS, but we need to keep looking at how do we keep the infrastructure going while we're going off in all these ways. And By the way, if you have a way how to solve that, please let us know.
Companies come, and unfortunately for some, companies go. Nothing is eternal, but open source isn't a company or the like. It's code which is out there and available to be used. The license is there. Unless someone writes laws making it illegal, the open source code basis will still be there 500 years from now. So one way it will persist forever, and the other way you just have to hope that the company doesn't go under. Well, otherwise you suddenly are scrambling to fix everything yourself.
I'll use my moment for another thought about the question earlier about community. Those of us that have been in open source for a long time tend to feel like we have all the answers. And one of the things that I have discovered as a great method for building community is allowing people to make, maybe not even mistakes, but make decisions that are different from what I would have done. Some of my most rewarding mentoring experiences have been when somebody that I'm mentoring has made a decision that I thought was stupid, and I've stepped back and said, it's your call now. And in most of those cases, it's turned out really well. So being willing to take your hands off the thing that you have created that is your baby and allowing somebody else to run with it. It's very difficult, but very effective.
For me, I'll share, I think, the kind of the topical concern of the year, at least for me looking at the open source community, is this idea that certain projects are trying to tailor these licenses for exclusionary purposes, whether they're for giant companies or whatever. It's still exclusionary. I don't think that's, having been in this community for 20 years, it doesn't feel like the right way of doing it. I understand that there's some hurt feelings and you're kind of looking at people profiting off. But, I think there's a place for all that in open source. And I just don't think that's the right solution. I'm glad that conversation is happening, but that's going to be sort of the conversation. I'm interested to see how it resolves here over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious that companies depend on open source, but it's also just as important, maybe not as obvious, that open source depends on companies. Open source, a lot of the people who are active within open source are lucky enough to work for companies who pay their salaries so they continue working on open source. That is an incredible benefit. The other thing is that people who are working in open source want their open source projects to be used. And so having companies there to sell those offerings, to basically, open those avenues, those business opportunities, provide that tight feedback loop on use cases that you as a independent open source developer would never imagine. You would never be able to figure out, or work in cases where you're looking at scales and things like that. There is this really, really tight relationship between commercial entities and open source communities. And I think that we really need to do everything we can to continue to foster that. So if you're an open source project, I encourage you to embrace the people who are using your software. And if you're a commercial company, I encourage you to embrace and help the open source projects that you're dependent upon.
All right, so my final thought, I just wanted to say thank you again to WebPros for their sponsorship of the Open Source Alley. Remind you all to please stop by the booths, talk to them. Open source has changed the way we compute over the last 20 years. There are always challenges that we debate. Commons Clause, as Michael brought up, the DNS. By the way, there are actually an unknown number of people with secret status that hold the keys to reconstitute DNS, just to make you feel a little better. So it can be that there is a continuity of government, if you will, plan for it. But these are challenges that we debate, and as a community, we grow and evolve and face whatever the challenges over the next 20 years. So thank you all for coming. Look forward to seeing you throughout the conference. So give it up for these panelists.